Warning, page 310. The prisoners put up the speakers, but speaking was so difficult, not only because each of them, as he spoke, was writing his future sentence, but also because in their experience of life and their ideas of truth, the grays and the blues had grown too far apart, and there was hardly any way of penetrating, of letting some light into those plump and prosperous carcasses, those glossy, melon-shaped heads. They seemed to have been greatly angered by an old Leningrad worker, a communist who had taken part in the revolution. He asked them what chance communism had when officers got fat on the output of camp workshops, when they had lead stolen from the separating plant and made into shot for their poaching trips, and when prisoners had to dig into their kitchen gardens for them, when carpets were laid in the bathhouse for the camp commander's visits, and an orchestra accompanied his ablutions. What chance indeed. To cut out some of this disorganized shouting, the discussions sometimes took the form of direct negotiations on the loftiest diplomatic model. Sometimes in June, a long mess table was placed in the women's camp, and the golden epaulets sealed themselves on a bench to one side of it, while the Tommy gunners allowed in with them as bodyguards stood their backs. Across the table sat members of the commission, and they too had a bodyguard, which stood there looking very serious, armed with sabers, pikes, and slingshots. In the background, crowds of prisoners gathered to listen to the powwow and shout comments. Refreshments for guests were not forgotten. Fresh cucumbers were brought from the hothouses in the service yard, and kvass from the kitchen. The golden epaulets crunched cucumbers unself-consciously. The rebels had agreed on their demands or requests in the first 2 days, and now repeated them over and over again. Punish the evangelist's murderer. Oh, that guy at the beginning of the chapter, who was almost done his tenure, had 30 days to go or something, or 3 months to go. Punish all those responsible for murders on Sunday night in the service yard. Punish those who beat up on the women. Bring back those comrades who had been illegally sent to closed prisons for striking. No more number patches, window bars, or locks on hut doors. Inner walls between camp divisions not to be rebuilt. An 8-hour day as for free workers. An increase in payment for work. There was no question of equality with free workers. Unrestricted correspondence with relatives, periodic visits, and review of cases. Although there was nothing unconstitutional in any of these demands, nothing that threatened the foundations of the state. Indeed, many of them were requests for a return to the old position. It was impossible for the bosses to accept even the least of them, because these bald skulls under service caps and supported by close-clipped fat necks, had forgotten how to admit a mistake or a fault. Truth was unrecognizable and repulsive to them if it manifested itself not in secret instructions from higher authority, but on the lips of common people. Still, the obduracy, of the 8,000 excuse me. Sorry. Of the 8,000 under siege was a blot on the reputation of the generals. It might ruin their careers. Sorry. It might ruin their careers. And so they made promises. They promised that nearly all the demands would be satisfied, only, they said, to make it more convincing, they could hardly leave the women's camp open. That was against the rules, forgetting that in the corrective labor camps, it had been that way for 20 years. But they could consider arranging, should they say, meeting days, to the demand that the Commission of Inquiry into the circumstances of the shooting should start its work inside the camp. The generals unexpectedly agreed, but Slushenkov guessed their purpose and refused to hear of it. While making their statements, the stoolies would expose everything that was happening in the camp. Review of cases, well, of course, cases would be re-examined, but prisoners would have to be patient. There was one thing that couldn't wait at all. The prisoners must get back to work, to work, to work. But the Czechs knew that trick by now, dividing them up into columns, forcing them to the ground at gunpoint, arresting the ringleaders. No, they answered across the table, and from the platform, no, shouted the voices from the crowd. The administration of Steplag have behaved like provocateurs. We do not trust the Steplag authorities. We don't trust the MVD. We don't trust even the MVD, said Vice Minister. The Vice Minister was thrown into a sweat by this treasonable talk. And who can have inspired in you such hatred for the MVD? A riddle, if ever there was one. Send us a member of the Central Committee of Presidium. A member of the Presidium, then we'll believe you, shouted the Czechs. Be careful, the generals threatened. You'll make worse for yourselves. At this, Kuznetsov got up. He spoke calmly and precisely, and he held himself proudly. If you enter the camp with weapons, he warned them, don't forget that half of those here had a hand in the capture of Berlin. They can cope even with your weapon. Captain Kuznetsov, some future historian of the Kengir mutiny, must help us understand the man better. What were his thoughts? How did he feel about his imprisonment? What stage did he imagine his appeal to have reached? How long was it since he had asked for a review? If the order of release with rehabilitation, I believe, arrived from Moscow during the rebellion, his pride in keeping the mutinous camp in such good order, was it the professional pride of a military man? Had he put himself at the head of the movement because it captured his imagination? I reject that explanation. Or, knowing his powers of leadership, had he taken over to restrain the movement, tame the flood, and channel it, to lay his chastened comrades at their master's feet? That is my view. In meetings and discussions, and through people of lesser importance, he had opportunities to tell those in charge of the punitive operation anything he liked, to hear things from them. On one occasion in June, for instance, the artful dodger Markosian was sent out of camp on an errand for the commission. Did Kuznetsov exploit such opportunities? Perhaps not. His position may have been a proud and independent one. 2 bodyguards, 2 enormous Ukrainian lads, accompanied Kuznetsov the whole time with knives in their belts to defend him, to settle scores. Makeyev claims that during the rebellion Kuznetsov also had a temporary wife, another Ukrainian nationalist, Gleb Slushenkov, I can never get that name, was about 30, which means that he must have been captured by the Germans when he was 19 or so, like Kuznetsov. He now went around in his old uniform, which had been kept in storage, acting or overacting the soldier. He had a slight limp, but the speed of his movements made it unimportant. In the negotiations, he was precise and to the point of curtness. The authorities had the idea of calling all former juvenile offenders out of camp, youngsters jailed before they were 18, some of them now 20 or 21, and releasing them. This may not have been a trick. At about this time, they were releasing such prisoners or reducing their sentences all over the country. Slushenkov's answer was this: have you asked the miners whether they want to move from one camp to another and leave their comrades in the lurch? In the commission, too, he insisted that these kids carry out our guard duties. We can't hand them over. This indeed was an unspoken reason why the generals wanted to release these youngsters while Kengir was in revolt. And for all we know, they would have shut them into cells outside the camps. The law-abiding Makeyev, nonetheless, began rounding up former juveniles for the discharge tribunal, and he testifies that out of 409 persons with a claim to be released, he only succeeded in collecting 13 who were willing to leave. If we bear in mind Makeyev's sympathy with the authorities and his hostility to the rising, his testimony is amazing. 400 youngsters in the bloom of youth, and their great majority not politically minded, renounced not merely freedom but slavery. Renounced not merely freedom but salvation, and stayed with the doomed revolt. Excuse me. Slushenkov's reply to the two threats that troops would be used to put down the revolt was, send them in. Send as many Tommy gunners as you like. We'll throw the ground glass into their eyes and take their guns from them. We'll trounce you Kengir troops. Your bow-legged officers will chase all the way to Karaganda. We'll ride into Karaganda on your backs. And once there, we're among friends. Sorry. There is other evidence about him which seems reliable. Anybody who runs away will get this in the chest, flourishing a hunting knife in the air. Anybody who doesn't turn out to defend the camp will get the knife, he announced in one hut. The inevitable logic of any military authority and any war situation. The newborn camp government, like all governments through the ages, was incapable of existing without a security service, and Slushenkov headed this, excuse me, occupying the security officer's room in the women's camp. Since there could be no victory over the outside forces, Slushenkov realized that this post meant certain execution. In the course of the revolt, he told people in the camp that the bosses had secretly urged him to provoke a racial bloodbath. The golden epaulets were banking heavily on this, and so provide a plausible excuse for troops to enter the camp. In return, In return, the bosses promised Lushenkov his life. He rejected their proposal. What approaches were made to others, they haven't told us. Moreover, when a rumor went around the camp that a Jewish pogrom was imminent, Lushenkov gave warning that the rumor mongers would be publicly flogged. The rumor died down. A clash between Lushenkov and the loyalists seemed inevitable, and it happened. It should be said that all these years, in all the special camps, Orthodox Soviet citizens, without even consulting each other, unanimously condemned the massacre of the Stoolies, or any attempt by prisoners to fight for their rights. We need not put this down to sordid moves, though quite a few of the Orthodox were compromised by their work for the Godfather, since we can fully explain it by their theoretical views. They accepted all forms of repression and extermination, even wholesale, provided it came from above, as a manifestation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Even impulse and uncoordinated actions of the same kind, but from below, regarded as banditry, and what is more, is its banderist form among the loyalists. You would never get one to admit the right of the Ukraine to secede, because to do so would be bourgeois nationalism. The refusal of the Katarzyna to be slave laborers, their indignation about the window bars and shootings, depressed and frightened the docile camp communists. In Kengir, as elsewhere, there was a nest of loyalists. Jenkin, Apfelzwig, Talalayevsky, and evidently Akayev. We have no more names. There was also a malingerer who spent years in the hospital pretending that his leg kept going around. Intellectual methods of struggle, such as this were deemed permissible. In the commission itself, Makayev was an obvious example. All of them were reproachful from the beginning. You shouldn't have started it. When the passages under the walls were blocked off, they said that they shouldn't have tunneled. It was all a stunt, though, thought up by the banderist scum, and the thing to do now was to back down quickly. Anyway, the 16 killed were not from their camp, and it was simply silly to shed tears over the evangelists. All their bile and bigotry is blurted out in Makayev's notes. Everything and everybody in sight is bad, and there are dangers on every hand. Either it's a new sentence from the bosses or a knife in the back from the banderists. They want to frighten us all with their bits of iron and drive us to our deaths. Makayev angrily calls the Kengir revolt a bloody game, a false trump, amateur dramatic on the part of the banderists, and more often than any of these, the wedding party. The hopes and aims of the leaders, as he sees them, were fornication, evasion of work, and putting off the day of reckoning. There was a reckoning to be paid, he tacitly assumes to be just. This very accurately expresses the attitude of the loyalists in the 50s to the freedom movements in the camps, whereas Makayev was very cautious, and was indeed among the leaders of the revolt. Talalayevsky poured out such complaints quite openly, and Lushenkov's internal security service locked him in a cell in the Kengir jailhouse for agitation hostile to the rebels. Yes, this really happened. The rebels who had liberated the jail, now set up one of their own, the old ironical story. True, only 4 men were put inside for various reasons, usually for dealings with the bosses, and none of them were shot. Instead, they were presented with the best alibis for the authorities. This incident part the jailhouse, a particularly gloomy old place built in the 30s, was put on display to a wide public. It had windowless solitary confinement cells with nothing but a tiny skylight, lightless beds, mere wooden boards on the cement floor, where it was still colder and damper than anywhere else in the cold cell, and beside each bed, which means down on the floor, a rough earthenware bowl like a dog dish. To this place, the agitation department organized sightseeing trips for their fellow prisoners who had never been inside and perhaps never would be. They also took their visiting generals who were not greatly impressed. They even asked that sightseers from among the free inhabitants of the settlement be sent along. With the prisoners absent, so they could in any case do nothing at the work sites, the generals actually sent such a party, not of course ordinary working men, but hand-picked personnel who found nothing to excite indignation. In reply, the authorities offered to arrange a prisoners' outing to Rudnik, Divisions 1 and 2 of Steplag, since according to camp rumors, a revolt had broken out there too, incidentally for their own good reasons. Both slaves and slave masters shunned the word revolt and still worse, rising, replacing them with the bashful euphemism horseplay. The delegates went and saw for themselves what it was as it had been, that all was as it had been, that prisoners were going to work. Their hopes largely depended on strikes like their own spreading. Now the delegates returned with cause for despondency. The authorities, in fact, had taken them there only just in time. Rudnik was, of course, worked up. Prisoners had heard from free workers all sorts of facts and fantasies about the Kengir revolt. In the same month, June, it so happened that many appeals for judicial review were turned down simultaneously. Then some half-crazy lad was wounded in the prohibited area, and there too a strike started. The gates between camp divisions were knocked down, and prisoners poured out onto the central road. Machine guns appeared on the towers. Somebody hung up a placard with anti-Soviet slogans on it and the rallying cry, "Freedom or Death." But this was taken down and replaced by one with legitimate demands and an undertaking to make up for losses caused by the stoppage once the demands were satisfied. Lorries came to fetch flour from the storerooms. The prisoners wouldn't let them have it. The strike lasted for something like a week, but we have no precise information about it. This is all at third hand and probably exaggerated. There were weeks when the whole bar became a war of propaganda. The outside radio was never silent. Through several loudspeakers set up at intervals around the camp, it interlarded appeals to the prisoners with information and misinformation, and with a couple of trite and boring records that frayed everybody's nerves. Through the meadow goes a maiden, she whose braided hair I love. Still, to be thought worthy even of that not very high honor, having records played to them, they had to rebel. Even rubbish like that wasn't played for men on their knees. These records also served, in the spirit of the times, as a jamming device, drowning the broadcasts from the camps intended for the escort troops. On the outside radio, they sometimes tried to blacken the whole movement, asserting that it had been started with the sole aim of rape and plunder. In the camp itself, the Zeks just laughed, but the free inhabitants of the settlement also listened willy-nilly to the loudspeakers. Of course, the slave masters could rise to any other explanation. Could not. An admission that this rabble was capable of seeking justice was far beyond the reach of their minds. At other times they tried telling filthy stories about members of the commission. They even said that one of the old ones, when he was being transported by barge to the Kolyma, had made a hole below the waterline and sunk the boat with 300 Zeks in it. The emphasis was on the fact that it was poor Zeks he had drowned. Practically all 58s, too, not the escort troops. How he had survived himself was not clear, or else they would taunt Kuznetsov, telling him that his discharge had arrived, but was now cancelled. Then the appeals would begin again. Work, work. Why should the Motherland keep you for nothing? By not going to work, you are doing enormous damage to the state. This was supposed to pierce the hearts of men doomed to eternal katorga. Whole trainloads of coal are standing in the siding. There's nobody to unload it. Let them stand there, the Zeks laughed. You'll give way all the sooner. Yes, it didn't occur even to them that the golden epaulets could unload it themselves, and if it troubled them so much. The technical department, however, gave as good as it got. 2 portable film projectors were found in the service yard. Their amplifiers were used for loudspeakers, less powerful, of course, than those from the other side. They were fed from the secret hydroelectric station. The fact that the camp had electricity and radio greatly surprised and troubled the bosses. They were afraid that the rebels might rig up a transmitter and start broadcasting news about their rising to foreign countries. Rumors to this effect were also put around inside the camp. The camp soon had its own announcers. Slava Yarmovskaya is one we know of. Programs included the latest news and news features. There was also a daily wall newspaper with cartoons. Crocodile Tears was the name of the program, ridiculing the anxiety of the MVD men about the fate of women whom they themselves had previously beaten up. Then there were programs for the escort troops. Apart from this, prisoners would approach the towers at night and shout to the soldiers through megaphones, but there was not enough power to put on programs for the political sympathizers, for the only potential sympathizers to be found in Kengir, the free inhabitants of the settlement, many of them exiles. It was they whom the settlement authorities were trying to fool, not by radio, but in some place which the prisoners could not reach, with rumors that bloodthirsty gangsters and insatiable prostitutes. This version went down well with the women, were ruling the roost inside the camp, that over there innocent people were being tortured and burned alive in furnaces. In that case, it was hard to see why the authorities did not intervene. How could the prisoners call out through the walls, the workers 1 or 2 or 3 kilometers away? To the workers, brothers, we want only justice. They were murdering us for no crime of ours. They were treating us worse than dogs. Here are our demands. The thoughts of the technical department, since they had no chance to outstrip modern science, moved backward instead to the science of past ages. Using cigarette paper, there was everything you could think of in the service yard. We have talked about that already for many years. It provided the Dej Kazgan officers with their own Moscow tailor shop and workshop for every imaginable article of consumer goods. They pasted together an enormous air balloon, followed the example of the Montgolfier brothers, and bundled leaflets. A bundle of leaflets was attached to the balloon, and slung underneath was a brazier containing glowing coals, which sent a current of warm air into the dome of the balloon through an opening in its base. To the huge delight of the assembled crowd, if the prisoners ever do feel happy, they are like children. The marvelous aeronautical structure rose and was airborne. But alas, the speed of the wind was greater than the speed of its ascent, and it was flying over the boundary fence. The brazier, as it was, brazier caught on a barbed wire. The balloon, denied its current of warm air, fell and burned to ashes, together with the leaflets. After this failure, they started inflating balloons with smoke. With a following wind, they flew quite well, exhibiting inscriptions in large letters to the settlement. Save the women and old men from being beaten. We demand to see a member of the Presidium. The guards started shooting at these balloons. Then some Chechen prisoners came to the technical department and offered to make kites. They are experts. They succeeded in tricking some kites together and paying out the string until they were over the settlement. There was a percussive device on the frame of each kite. When the kite was in a convenient position, the device scattered a bundle of leaflets also attached to the kite. The kite flyers sat on the roof of a hut, waiting to see what would happen next. If the leaflets fell close to the camp, the warders ran to collect them. If they fell further away, motorcyclists and horsemen dashed after them. Whatever happened, they tried to prevent the free citizens from reading an independent version of the truth. The leaflets ended by requesting any citizen of Kengir who found one to deliver it to the Central Committee. The kites were also shot at, but hurling was less damaging to them than to the balloons. The enemy soon discovered that sending up counter kites to tangle the strings with them was cheaper than keeping a crowd of warders on the run. A war of kites in the second half of the 20th century, and all to silence a word of truth. I love that. Perhaps it will help the reader to place the events at Kengir chronologically if we recall what was happening outside during the days of the mutiny. The Geneva Conference in Indochina was in session. The Stalin Peace Prize was conferred on Pierre Cot. Another progressive Frenchman, the writer Sartre, arrived in Moscow to join in the life of our progressive story. The third centenary of the reunification of Russia and Ukraine was loudly and lavishly celebrated. On May 31st, there was a solemn parade on Red Square. The Ukrainian SSR and the Russian SFSR were awarded the Order of Lenin. On June 6th, a monument to Yuri Dolgorsky was unveiled in Moscow. A trade union congress opened on June 8th, but nothing was said about Kengir. On the 10th, a new state loan was launched. The 20th was Air Force Day, and there was a splendid parade at Tushino. These months of 1954 were also marked by a powerful offensive on the literary front, as people call it. Surkov, Ch12, and Yermolov came out with very tough monetary articles. Ch12 even asked, "What sort of times are we living in?" And nobody answered, "A time of prison camp rising." Many incorrect plays and books were abused during this period, and in Guatemala the imperialistic United States met with the rebuff it deserved. There were Chechen exiles in the settlement, but it is unlikely that they made the other kites. You cannot accuse the Chechens of ever having served oppression. They understood perfectly the meaning of the Kengir revolt, and on one occasion brought a bakery van up to the gates. Needless to say, the soldiers drove them away. There is more than one side to the Chechens. People among whom they live, I speak from my experience in Kazakhstan, find them hard to get along with. They are rough and arrogant, but they do not conceal their dislike of Russians. But the men of Kengir only had to display independence and courage, and they immediately won the goodwill of the Chechens. When we feel that we are not sufficiently respected, we should ask ourselves whether we are living as we should. In the meantime, the technical department was getting its notorious secret weapon ready. Let me describe it. Aluminum corner brackets for cattle troughs, produced in the workshops and awaiting dispatch, were packed with a mixture of sulfur scraped from matches and a little calcium carbide. Every box of matches had been carried off to the room with the 100,000-volt door. When the sulfur was lit and the brackets thrown, they hissed and burst into little pieces. But neither these star-crossed geniuses nor the field staff in the bathhouse were to choose the hour, place, or form of the decisive battle. Some 2 weeks after the beginning of the revolt, on one of those dark nights without a glimmer of light anywhere, thuds were heard in several places around the camp wall. This time it was not escaping prisoners or rebels battering it down. The wall was being demolished by the convoy troops themselves. There was a commotion in the camp as the prisoners charged around with pikes and sabers, unable to make out what was happening and expecting an attack, but the troops did not take the offensive. In the morning it turned out that the enemy without had made about a dozen breaches in the wall in addition to those already there, and the barricaded gateway in the wall and the barricaded gateway. Machine gun posts had been set up on the other side of the gaps to prevent the Czechs from pouring through them. This was, of course, the preliminary for an assault through the breaches, and the camp would see a seething anthill as it prepared to defend itself. The rebel staff decided to pull down the inner walls and the mud brick outhouses to erect a second circular wall of their own, specially reinforced with stacks of brick where it faced the gaps, to give protection against machine gun bullets. How things had changed. The troops were demolishing the boundary wall and the prisoners were rebuilding it, and the thieves were helping with a clear conscience, not feeling that they were contravening their code. Additional defense posts now had to be established opposite the gaps, and every platoon assigned to a gap, which it must run to defend should the alarm be raised at night. Bangs on the buffer of a railroad car, and the usual whistles were the agreed-upon alarm signals. The Czechs quite seriously prepared to advance against machine guns with pikes. Those who shied at the idea to begin with soon got used to it. It's getting exciting. There's only one part left tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.